This is CS 124, Lesson 1.6, If Statements. By now you should already be familiar with how to declare a Boolean variable and how to convert a logic problem into a Boolean expression. Today's lecture is on creating an if statement and the pitfalls associated with if statements. If statements allow your program to determine which course of action to take depending on the result of a Boolean expression. To set up our if statement, we need to use the keyword if, followed by a Boolean expression contained in parentheses. Finally, we need the body statement, which is the action to be carried out if the condition is met. In this example, assign late is a Boolean variable. We are checking if it is set to true. If it is set to true, the variable assignment grade is set to 0. If the Boolean expression evaluates false, then this line is skipped entirely. This is an action or no action if statement, because either a certain action takes place or nothing happens. Another way to use an if statement is an if-else statement. In this case, if the if statement evaluates false, the if body statement is skipped, and the else body statement is executed. To demonstrate if statements, we've got two functions set up. Our main, which will demonstrate an action or no action if statement, and another function that will demonstrate an action A, action B if statement. What we want to do is get a GPA from the user. So now we need to do our prompt, and now we have our information from the user. So now what we want to do is find out if this GPA is valid or not. In order to do that, we're going to come up here and create a function to find out if the GPA is within certain number ranges. Notice that our function is a bool because it either will be within the correct ranges or it will not be. So it's a true or false. We are taking the GPA as a parameter and it is of type float. Now what we want to do is return false if the GPA is not valid and return true otherwise. So we'll do if it's not valid, return false. And now we want to return true, so that will be an else, because otherwise we want to return true. Now let's come down here and write our function call. And I already mentioned that we probably want to have this in an if statement, because we want to output an error message if this returns false. So let's write in our error statement. So now we say if our function does not return true, or if it returns false, we will output this error message. Now we'll add a return statement and see how this runs. And let's first say our GPA is 5.0. As expected, we got a false return here because it is outside of this number range, and so we did get our error message. Now let's try it with a valid GPA. This time we did not get the error message because our GPA was, in fact, within the valid range. Now that we've covered the basics of an if statement, we can talk about some details. Sometimes, if an if condition is met, we want to do multiple things. This is simple enough. We simply include all the lines of code that we want executed if the statement evaluates true inside a set of curly braces. If the if statement evaluates false, everything within these curly braces is skipped over without being executed. Often, it is useful to have an if statement within the body of another if. For example, if this particular program already has a person's number grade, we might want to find their letter grade. This first if checks the number grade we already have. If it's within the range of 90 and 100, then we know they got the letter grade A. Then we might want to determine if they got an A+ or an A-. To do this, we add a set of nested if statements. We determine if the grade is below a 93, then they got an A-. If it's above a 97, then they got an A+. However, if the overlying if is determined false, neither of these statements will be considered. As you've noticed, an if can only differentiate between two options, one or the other. We can solve this by adding nested ifs like this. However, a simpler and more efficient way to do this exact same code would be like this. If the first if returns true, neither the else if nor the else statements will be checked because we already found our answer. However, If the first if statement is false, the else statement is checked. If it is true, then the else statement is ignored. The else statement only gets evaluated if all the statements preceding it are false. Now I'm going to demonstrate how to use a series of if statements versus using a series of else if statements. As you can see, I've already got my main set up. We're going to prompt the user for a number grade, and then we're going to write a function to calculate the letter grade based on the inputted number grade. So that's going to be up here. We will take in a float, and that will be the number grade, and we will return a character, and that will be the letter grade. In order to do this, we're going to check the number grade we're given and see if it's within a certain range of values, just like we did in our examples. So if it's between 90 and 100, we know it's an A, and 80 and an 89, we know it's a B. So now we have a series of code that checks if it's a 90 to 100, then it reassigns letter grade to an A. If it's between an 80 and a 90, they get a B, 70 and 80 C, 60, 70 D, and if it's below a 60, they get an F. And then we return the letter grade. Now we can write our function call. We want to simply display whatever the function returns, so our function call will be right here. Alright, so we'll start by putting in an F, and it gave us an F. Now let's try putting in an A. We got an A. We'll try one more, and we'll put in what should be a C, and it gave us a C. Now, there is another way to do this, where we wouldn't need these redundant AND statements, and that's by using else ifs. Let's try. Now that we have the else ifs, let's compare it to the original ifs. Here we have an entire additional line that we don't need. We say it's got to be greater than 90 and less than or equal to 100, but here all we check is it's greater than 90. If it's greater than 90, we'll get an A. If it's not, we'll check the next one. If it's greater than or equal to an 80, we get a B. That can only happen if this returns false. Now, if both of these return false, and it's not greater than 80, then we'll check if it's greater than a 70. If it's not greater than a 70, it's also not greater than an 80 and not greater than a 90, so we check if it's greater than a 60. If it is greater than a 60, we already know it's got to be less than a 70 because it's not greater than a 70, which means it would be a D. If it's not greater than a 60, it's an F. Now we can get rid of this code and run it again. Alright, we'll start with a 50, which should be an F. Because a 50 is not greater than a 90, 80, 70, or 60, it had to be below a 60, which means it's an F. Now let's try a D. Alright, and finally, an A. Now we're going to take a second to talk about common mistakes that happen when you use an if statement. Right now, we've got a simple display set up that says you can choose 1, 2, or 3, and based on which one you choose, you get a nice complement. So I'm going to show you how that should run first. We choose a 2, we get the second complement. Alright? Now, what we're going to do is, on accident, use the assignment operator instead of the comparison operator. Remember that an assignment operator is a single equals, while a comparison operator is a double equals. Now, it doesn't matter what we put in, we're always going to get the first complement, because what happened is we reassigned the choice to 1 by using the assignment operator. This is an easy enough fix if you see it in your own code. Just make sure that you're using the comparison and not the assignment operator. The second pitfall we're going to talk about is an extra semicolon. So now we've got a simple question, and you can answer yes or no. And I'll show you how that's supposed to work. Alright. Now, when we say extra semicolon, what we mean is right here. You should never have a semicolon there because you want to go into your body statement and put the semicolon in the body statement. If you put your extra semicolon here, the error you get is else without previous if, because it sees an else, but the if has been cut off. Now for sake of argument, we'll get rid of this. And it doesn't matter what our choice is, we always get this cout statement. If we tab everything over, we see why. We have this, and then the cout statement, which is completely unrelated to what's going on in our if statement. So it doesn't matter what our choice is, we'll always get this output. The final pitfall we're going to talk about today is missing curly braces. When we say missing curly braces, we're talking about these. These curly braces are here because I want to display and I want to change the choice to N, all in the same thing. So let's see how this is supposed to work first. Well, I do want to hear a poem, and so I get a poem. And if I give any other answer, I don't hear a poem. So if we take away these curly braces, our output gets messed up. What actually happens here is this part is completed. The if catches on this cout and it would display. But the choice isn't changed back to N. And so we miss part of what we want our command to be. So it's really important to make sure you have your curly braces around all lines of code that you want to be within your if statement. So after today, you should be ready to implement if statements into your code, and you should be prepared to know how to do some debugging with your if statements.